So moving on to Lourdes, who will be talking about estimates for health costs, externalities of fossil fuel use, and the opportunity cost of fossil fuel subsidies. Over to you, Lourdes.
Thank you very much, and thank you also to Barak for the very interesting previous presentation. So yes, Sarah says I'm going to be talking numbers actually today, and numbers in terms of what is the cost of fossil fuels to society in the form of externalities, and also in terms, to taxpayers in the form of subsidies. Because one of the things that actually, well, we're here to talk about taxing fossil fuels. And indeed, there are many initiatives, as you all know, in terms of carbon pricing and so on. But one of the things that we also need to look at, and should be one of the main priorities when talking about establishing the right pricing of fossil fuels to external, or to reflect the real cost of society, is that there's something called also fossil fuel subsidies that act as a negative tax. And actually, when you put both together in terms of the current initiatives, overall, it comes that fossil fuels are more subsidized and actually taxed. So that's why I want to start presenting here what is the total value, the global value of fossil fuels subsidies in the past few years. So these are data compiled from the main organizations that produce fossil fuel subsidy data. So that means the OECD and the IEA mostly in this case. And then what we see is that in 2019, fossil fuel subsidies cost to taxpayers in the end over or almost $470 billion US. So this is a huge number that again acts as a negative tax to fossil fuels, divert public finance, and well, also creates significant externality cost. So when we think about, this money could be also spent in other important public services or public areas. Not only that is a huge number, but also we see that in several countries, the amount of public budget that is assigned to fossil fuel subsidies is bigger, or at least comparable to the amounts assigned to education or even health, for example. These are a bit old data from 2014, but still the reality keeps on being like that. Also, as I said, so there's a huge cost of externalities associated to the consumption of fossil fuels. And these are data coming from the IMF, and there we see that actually, if we add up the cost of externalities, considering the cost as that associated to climate change, air pollution, also what they call vehicle externalities. So that means road accidents or road use, etc. And also the revenue forgone. That means the taxes that are not collected because there's a subsidy. Then in total, the IMF estimates that in the latest years, so 2019, there's that cost around $6 trillion US. So again, this is a huge cost to society and in general, well, to taxpayers when we focus more on the subsidies part. So this is a complex topic, and that's why I want to bring a little bit more of clarity in terms of where are these subsidies going, so that it can also help the discussion in terms of taxation of fossil fuels. And I'm going to start looking at where actually most of these subsidies are going to. So again, I'm talking only about subsidies, not the externalities here. And here we see that most of subsidies that are today estimated or evaluated, they are going to petroleum products. So that means mostly gasoline and diesel for transport, but also other derivatives of petroleum. Also to highlight that coal seems is a very small number, but actually we have the whole bunch of electricity subsidies here. And, sometimes it's hard to estimate or to disaggregate whether coal, because, coal is mostly used to generate electricity. So sometimes it's hard to disaggregate the value of coal subsidies within the electricity. So actually, even if the figure looks like very small, there's a lot of coal hidden also in this yellow part that means electricity. Also, who is getting most of these subsidies? So according to current estimates, we see that most of the subsidies are going to lower the price of consumption of fossil fuels. But again, here there's a tricky part, and actually is that many subsidies to the production of fossil fuels are not estimated. So that they are identified, but we cannot put values there, basically because transparency is limited, and sometimes it's also hard to calculate and estimate those subsidies. But that's also a big thing that comes when we're thinking on taxing fossil fuels. It's like sometimes actually, and we're going to see in the next slide, basically there are already subsidies in the form of not taxing fossil fuels. So there's even a big opportunity there. And this is what I meant with the taxation. So when we look at where exactly or in which form these subsidies are given, we see that according to current estimates, again, most of the subsidies are in the form of what we call induced transfers. Induced transfers is basically support to the consumption prices. But we see that a big part, again, is going in the form of what we call tax expenditure. So that means missing taxes or lower taxes than what they should be. And as mentioned before, these are actually most likely or actually significantly underestimated, because sometimes, well, first, it's complicated to estimate what is the associated tax, because what is the tax benchmark that should apply to the production or consumption of fossil fuels? And second, because many measures is not very clear actually to which base the tax exemption should be applied. So that's why it's a mix of complexity in calculation and also transparency that makes that this number, even if it's today is around 30% of the equivalent of subsidies, actually is very likely to be much higher. And just to to kind of bring together the number or like some estimates on taxation and fossil fuel subsidy reform. I mean, we've been doing some thinking at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and actually to make it easier, considering all this complexity of fossil fuel subsidies, etc. Let's say the low-hanging fruits in order to tax when it comes to fossil fuels and also reform the subsidies is to focus on transport fuels, so gasoline and diesel, and also coal for power generation. If we look at these fuels and we look first at what will be if we reform the subsidies, the consumer subsidies to these fuels, and also we implement some kind of or a modest tax increase, in total we see that per year we can raise up to $550 billion. And again, this is a figure by year based on average consumption levels before COVID. Just to highlight a little bit or to specify a little bit, what is the tax increases that we foresee here? So for gasoline and diesel, the estimate is considering an increase of 12.5 cents US dollar per liter. And for coal, that will be around $5 per ton. So this is the equivalent of $40 per ton of CO2 for gasoline and diesel and $2 per ton of CO2 for coal, which are like reflecting kind of the either the most recent discussions, or in the case of coal, it's actually a low one, but well, will be like a starting point to learn about coal pricing. I mean, or pricing of let's say CO2. So this is my presentation. I'm happy to answer any question afterwards. Thank you.